Part 2, stand part. This is a debate on clauses 4 to 126 and the schedule. David Clark.
Mr. Chair, I'm surprised the Minister didn't beat me to his feet again. It's a bill that we have in front of us that does introduce a number of changes. He was very keen to rush it through the Select Committee stage, announcing it just before Christmas with a report back date in early February that saw many of the larger tax agencies huffing and puffing because they were not happy that the changes made in this bill were being rushed through this House. This Minister is keen to see these changes go ahead. He's keen to see his tax legislation put through. It's a wonder he didn't have with him also a supplementary order paper to introduce the changes he announced by press release last Friday, which would see double taxation on some corporate bodies in terms of their GST payments that will cost some of them millions of dollars. And interestingly, is very similar to the case that was taken against Muldoon when he cancelled the super scheme in the 1970s. Muldoon announced, of course, by press release that he was going to roll the scheme back and that members did not need to contribute to it anymore. And we know that that savings scheme would today be worth $200 to $300 billion had it been kept, and that New Zealand's retirement savings would be a lot sounder, a lot deeper and a lot more beneficial if that had happened. Now, this Minister is doing the same things that Muldoon did, and it's a shame that he can't learn those mistakes of history from 40 years ago, as my colleague opposite says. It's a shame that he's repeating those same mistakes of 40 years ago and are making tax policy changes by press release. Certainly tax practitioners have spotted it. They're uncomfortable with it. It's not good practice to try and change the law without actually having the checks and balances. And that's also reflected in this particular law that we are passing through the House now, because we see already that the Minister is bringing some supplementary order papers to correct mistakes that were in the bill already that the Select Committee didn't have time to process. We had, through the Select Committee process, various people saying to us, those learned tax people saying to us, look, if we'd had a bit more time, we might have ironed this out, or we might have debated the principles a bit more. Why on earth are we introducing these strange rules around trusts, around employee allowances and so on, that don't seem to add up, that haven't had the full input that they should have in a tax bill that is properly consulted on? Because what happens then is that the Parliament ends up spending a whole lot of time correcting mistakes. And another recent example of that, of course, is with the child support legislation that this Minister had to reverse out of, having after the government had put through a law that said the child support payments will be calculated on a different basis. We had the government taking more of Parliament's time to reverse those changes out because it was decided that it was too hard to put them into effect. And that, of course, cost millions of dollars of taxpayer money to do that, to bring a law in and to take it out again. And that is irresponsible, frankly, and it shows that the government doesn't really have a vision for where the tax system could go and should go. It doesn't have an oversight of the development and implementation of policy that it ought to have. And we know a lot of that goes back, of course, to the IRD computer system. And I'm worried, Mr. Chair, about some of the changes here in this bill in Part 2 and whether, in fact, they will actually be able to be implemented. Because we know that the technology the IRD relies upon was put in place in 1993. The technology that the IRD relies upon is a lot older than Google. It's a lot older than Facebook. In fact, it's a decade older than Facebook, the technology of the IRD computer system. And very few companies, businesses, governments rely on computer technology that is over 20 years old to collect taxation. And that means that it's very hard for customers to interact, for people, ordinary taxpayers, to interact with the tax department. And voluntary business compliance is dropping. It's interesting on the IRD website to note that the statistics for voluntary business compliance run out in 2012, where other statistics are carried through to 2013, and one wonders why that might be. It's a trend that's not happy. It doesn't reflect well upon the government. I've recently heard more reports of people not getting through on the phone lines, finding it incredibly frustrating to get through to the IRD. And a lot of this hinges on a department that has not been well supported by this government. The minister knew that this system needed upgrading, that the IRD computer system needed upgrading when he came into office, Mr. Chair.
David Clark.
And this computer system is what will be relied upon when this legislation is introduced, and when it's put through the House, will be relied upon to make it happen for people outside in the world outside. But this 5 years on, nearly 6 years on under this government, we know that over $50 million has been spent on international consultants to try and work out what needs to be done there. And where they have reached the point is that they are now saying at the IRD that what we were told, what the national government were told when they came into office 6 years ago, is in fact what needs to happen now. They've got nowhere effectively in 6 years. And back in 2012, John Key said, you don't want to be held up by a lack of technology. You don't want your tax system held to ransom by a lack of technology. Mr. Key promised that he would be getting onto it straight away. Well, 2 years have passed. Over 2 years have passed since he made that statement, and still no progress. We have a new minister who is getting up to speed with the system, with the portfolio. We hope for good things, although in part one he's hiding his lamp under a bushel on presenting advice to this Parliament about why these changes are good. We'll look forward to him in part two, perhaps, explaining how they will be implemented under this new, how they will be implemented with this dated technology in place. What assurances he can give us that they can actually be implemented, so that we're not back here in the Parliament again removing the legislation because it embarrassingly can't be implemented because the minister hasn't given IRD the support it needs to get on with the project of redeveloping that computer system that we know we all need. Now, New Zealand, of course, is not the only country in the Western world that needs a tax system. We're not unique in that regard. Western countries replace their tax systems. This government, for some reasons, has sat on its hand for 6 years, knowing when it came into office that it was already dated technology, and seemingly done nothing except hand over money to contractors from offshore, to big multinationals, to develop plans, to rehash those plans, and to really take us not very far at all. So this government needs to get on with that, because it is a problem that future governments will hold. If the tax system can't do its duty, we won't be able to afford the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the infrastructure that we all rely upon in this country to have a prosperous future. We've had those things in the past. We've had a functional tax system in the past. This government has been neglecting it, and so I worry that the items listed in part two of this bill will not be able to be implemented because of this minister's lack of attention to the IRD tax system. And he's not unique there. His predecessors must carry most of the blame. But I would like to hear from this minister a credible time frame, and some kind of indication about when our tax system is going to be working properly, when tax simplification is going to happen, when a capital gains tax could actually be practically implemented. So far from this minister, nothing except platitudes and a commitment to the status quo, when even his Prime Minister has said that change could not be made in the system. Even his Prime Minister has said that over 2 years ago. So I am looking forward to his contribution. And of course, we also know that alongside that ancient computer system is an increasing record of privacy leaks. And there was the big privacy leak issue in 2012, where 32 serious breaches happened at the IRD, and we know that a year on, there was a 500% increase. So that is also about this computer system, which is the computer system that will be implementing this legislation, which will have privacy implications. Mr. Chair, you rightly bring me back to the bill itself. And these privacy implications in the bill, because we are dealing with employment matters and wages and other items that are significant tax rates, amounts of tax paid, IRD numbers, all of those things are intimately entwined in the legislation we're passing, and affect each and every New Zealander. The IRD holds our most sensitive information, and so when they're enacting these parts of the bill, we see that they will be handing over their information. They'll be required to make disclosures, and the IRD holds that information about the nature of a charity, for example, about its records, everything that's in this bill, housing trusts, their nature and so on. It's all held by the IRD and can be released improperly if the computer system is not up to date. Mr Chair, we also heard in the Select Committee a number of presentations where concerns were raised about the trust rates for housing, the discretionary powers of the Minister to Mr Chair. The discretionary ability of the Minister to choose which tax rates should apply to which trusts and which would be deemed to be worthy housing trusts with a social benefit, which are charitable and which are not. And this discretionary power is very, very unusual in terms of the Minister's responsibilities. So I'm interested to hear what the Minister will say about that, what his view about it is, why that discretion should be allowed for a Minister, because it seems pretty odd that the Minister should be having such arbitrary powers, and certainly that was raised by tax experts along the way. This Minister, as we know, is new to the role, so he will have some fresh thinking, and we're looking forward to hearing what that is. We've already challenged him to tell us about the default capital gains tax that he has said stands in place of the capital gains tax that Labor would introduce. He hasn't engaged on that in part one, but by the way he's scrawling notes now, I'm hopeful that we will get a more fulsome response in part two, and some pearls of wisdom from a new Minister, keen to make his mark, keen to show that this government will actually make a difference, will upgrade the computer system, give some kind of clarity around timeframes, around the nature of the upgrade, around costs involved, because even that has not been clarified yet. Whether it's going to be 700 million, as Bill English once said, $1 billion, as I think Mr Dunn said, and up to 1.5 billion, as somebody else, maybe Mr Key once said. These are things that we need some certainty about as taxpayers, to know that our tax system is being looked after, that our private details will be secure, that the tax system will be functional into the future, flexible, able to respond to a changing international tax environment where multinational tax avoidance is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and functionally able to do the very basics that it has historically done. So when the Minister speaks about community housing entities, I do wish to hear him explain why there should be such a wide range of discretionary powers to approve or disapprove of charitable exemptions. That really does give the Minister the effective right to confer lower taxes on some but not all taxpayers, and that seems to be bad law. You know, frankly, that is bad law. And this is to be done under guidelines that are not even proposed in the legislation. Mixed housing areas look set to be excluded. The cuts across the efforts, this cuts across the efforts to attract teachers, doctors and other professionals to areas with prohibitive housing prices. So these changes made in the legislation will have social impacts, and the Minister is responsible for making decisions about who pays what rate of tax, and that is not defined in the legislation. It is very unusual. It is very unusual. And the tax experts said with some more time, these things could have been ironed out. But the Minister has been rushing this through the House, perhaps a lack of back planning, perhaps a bit of a shambles in the handover as his predecessor lost his ministerial role over an issue around privacy, ironically, when we also have these privacy breaches at the IRD. But the Minister will tell us, I trust, about how these anomalies are in there, like a trust supplying housing to teachers in a remote housing area appears to be granted an exemption, while a school that houses teachers will not. If one set up a trust for tax accountants, it may well have a tax-exempt status, and yet it would be hard to argue that there was a social good or a charitable purpose, although the tax accountants might argue that. A religion, yeah. Well, tax is a religion for some, so I guess there's possibilities there. But seriously, I do look forward to the Minister explaining why he should have these discretionary powers, why he should be able to confer lower tax rates upon some citizens than others, and where this will all end. This is a piece of legislation that could have been better. It's a piece of legislation that will no doubt come back to the House to amend over time because of the rush nature and because of the inability at times of the department to implement things because that computer system is out of date, because of this government's lack of attention to detail. On this side of the House, we want a more positive future. We want every New Zealander to have the knowledge that this tax system is functional. We want it to be collecting the taxes fairly, where they're due, as they fall, including from multinational companies. We want a New Zealand that has the resources to support good schools, hospitals and all of those other basics that New Zealand needs.
Darian Fenton.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I'm happy to take call in part 2, and as I indicated in my speech in part 1, I'm particularly interested in the issues around the changes to